awakening in the wide silence of the trade station orbiting the moon of Varine. The hum of engines and chatter of many species filled the long metallic halls. Traders came and went, their ships heavy with cargo and stories. But in the corner of Dock Bay 12, a young human mechanic named Ishan worked quietly. His hands were quick, his voice calm. And though many aliens ignored him, they all trusted his repairs because his ships never failed. He came from Earth, a world the galaxy barely noticed, a place others called simple or slow, but his eyes carried a focus that unsettled some. That day, as he checked the seals on a shuttle core, a soft, melodic laugh reached his ears. It came from Lyrix, the alien girl who often stopped by the docks with her friends. Her species, the Virulans, were tall and elegant, their skin marked by faint glowing lines that pulsed with emotion. Lyrix was young and curious, proud of her heritage and even prouder of her family's history as ancient warriors of light armor, though most now said those stories were myths. She waved at Ishan with amusement in her eyes and held a sleek armor, chestplate in her arms, black and silver with strange runes that shimmered when touched by light. She teased him, saying that humans were too fragile to wear real armor and that her ancestors' suits would crush him before he could lift them. Ishan smiled and shrugged, saying nothing. His quietness always made her talk more, and that day she wanted to prove her point. She told him it was only a ceremonial relic, not even active anymore, just a family heirloom from a time when Virulans ruled the skies. Then, with a grin, she tossed the chest plate toward him and said he could try it if he wanted, just for a laugh. Ishan caught it, the weight surprising him. The metal felt alive, like it breathed with a rhythm matching his heartbeat. He placed it carefully over his chest, expecting nothing. But the moment it touched his skin, the air in the dock changed. The runes glowed with a fierce white light, lines of energy ran across his arms, and the armor sealed itself perfectly as if molded for him. The laughter around them stopped. A soft hum grew, deep and ancient, vibrating through the floor. Lyrix froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. The armor had never responded to her or anyone in her family for generations, yet here it was alive in the hands of a human. Then came the voice, calm and mechanical, speaking in a language neither of them knew, yet both understood. It called him bearer of the Starborn code, and asked if he was ready to resume duty. Ishan stumbled backward, confused, and the armor tightened like a second skin. He felt power rushing through him, his senses expanding beyond the station walls. He could feel the pulse of reactors, the flow of air, even the movement of people in nearby corridors. Lyrix shouted at him to take it off, but it was too late. The armor had bonded and was now part of him. A shockwave burst outward, knocking over crates and tools, sending energy readings off the scale. Across the station, alarms blared. Security. Drones flew toward Dock Bay 12 as scanners detected an ancient signal, one not seen since the old wars. The signal traveled fast, reaching listening posts and abandoned satellites across the system. Somewhere in the deep void, an old enemy recognized it. The symbol of the Virulin war armor had awakened, and they wanted it back. Lyrix grabbed Ishan's arm, eyes filled with both awe and fear. She told him her people used to say the armor chose only those whose spirit matched the will of the Starborn, the first warriors who defended life itself when chaos ruled the galaxy. She had always thought those were bedtime stories, but now it stood before her, real and undeniable. Ishan looked at his hands and saw faint arcs of blue energy forming between his fingers. The armor whispered to him, teaching him to control it, but the lessons came too fast. When he took a step, his boots magnetized and released without command, letting him walk on any surface. When he raised his hand, a small drone nearby floated and turned slowly, obeying his thought. Security guards rushed in, demanding he power down. Lyrix tried to explain, but no one listened. They aimed stunners, and the armor responded by forming a soft energy field around Ishan. The shots bounced off harmlessly. He did not attack back, he only shouted for them to stop, his voice amplified by the armor like thunder. The guards fell silent, unsure whether to fear or respect what they saw. Lyrix stepped beside him and told them he was not the enemy. Then the intercom crackled. a deep voice ordering everyone to stand down and report to command. The station's director had seen the energy readings and knew this was beyond ordinary protocol. In the control tower, the Council's local agent watched through cameras and recognized the symbol on the armor. He sent a private transmission to unknown coordinates reporting that the legacy armor of the Virilan Starguard was active again, bonded to a human. His orders were clear: recover the armor at any cost. Down in the bay, Ishan felt the armor pulse again. The voice whispered about enemies closing in and asked for a command. He said softly that he wanted to keep everyone safe. The light dimmed, and the armor shifted into a neutral state as if listening. Lyrics looked at him, half in wonder, half in dread. She said quietly that her people would see him as a threat or a prophecy, maybe both. Ishan only said that he never wanted to steal anything, that she could take it back. But the armor answered for her, saying the bond could not be undone while danger remained. Through the observation windows, new lights appeared in the sky, ships dropping from warp, fast and armed. The sensors called them raiders, but Lyrics knew better. Those were retrieval teams from the Council. The signal had called them, and they were coming straight for Dock Bay 12. As klaxons wailed across the station, she grabbed his hand and said they had to run. The armor shifted again, ready to move, and the human who was once just a quiet mechanic became the center of a legend about to begin. First test. The alarms echoed through every corridor as the sky outside filled with flashes of incoming ships. Lyrics pulled Ishan through the service tunnels, while the armor adjusted around him, forming smooth plating that moved like living muscle. The hum of reactors mixed with the deep rhythm of his heartbeat, and every sound felt sharper, clearer, more alive. Lyric spoke quickly, telling him that the ships were not random raiders but Council retrieval units disguised as pirates. They were hired to take relics of power and erase witnesses so no one could prove that the Council had hidden ancient truths. She said her people used to guard such relics before their pride and politics shattered their unity. Now the Council wanted to make sure the armor never returned to those who could truly use it. Ishan tried to understand as they ran, but the armor kept whispering data into his mind. He could see heat signatures through walls and sense the energy cores of incoming drones. He asked the armor what it wanted from him, and the voice replied that its purpose was to protect life and balance power. It said that he had been accepted because his choices showed restraint under fear, and that the test had begun. Lyrics led him to a maintenance bay where an old tug ship waited, small, rusty, but functional. She told him to get aboard while she handled the airlock. She still could not believe what was happening, and looked at him with a strange mix of respect and guilt. She had offered him the armor as a joke now. The joke had turned into prophecy. Outside the station, explosions flashed as the first wave of raiders forced docking clamps open. They moved fast and silent, their armor black with red insignias, their weapons humming with heat. The civilians panicked, running through corridors while drones fired warning shots. Ishan could feel the pressure of the attack before he saw it. He turned to Lyrics and said he could stop them for a moment if the armor let him. The voice inside the armor asked for confirmation of combat mode. He said yes. The air shimmered around him as the armor released a low wave of energy. The gravity shifted slightly in the bay. Tools floated, then fell again. The first raiders cut through the door, but before they could aim, Ishan raised his hand, and the armor extended a glowing field that bent the shots away. He stepped forward, instinct guiding him, though his body moved as if trained for years. Every motion flowed with purpose. He disarmed one raider using his bare hand, twisting the weapon aside without harm, and kicked the other back into a wall. The armor calculated pressure points, minimizing injury while maximizing control. Lyrics watched with awe. He was not fighting for glory, only to stop harm, and the armor seemed to grow calmer with every choice. When the last raider fell back, retreating to regroup, Ishan helped a wounded dock worker to safety. The man stared up at him in disbelief, calling him a Starborn warrior. But Ishan only shook his head and said he was just trying to help. Lyrics pulled him back to the tug, saying more ships were coming. She entered coordinates for an escape route through the maintenance tunnels of the station. The armor projected a map showing them a path with minimal patrols. They ran together as more alarms screamed and the lights flickered from damage control fires. At one junction, a massive blast tore through the ceiling, throwing them both down. The air filled with smoke and sparks. Lyrix coughed and tried to stand, but her leg was hurt. Ishan reached out and the armor reacted instantly, forming a shield that deflected falling debris. He lifted her easily and carried her forward, his steps steady despite the heat and chaos. When they reached the lower docks, they saw the station defense turrets turning toward the raider fleet. The council trying to contain the situation, but the raiders were already inside. Ishan placed Lyrix down near the tug entrance and turned to face the corridor. He could feel the next wave approaching. The armor spoke again, saying this was the second phase of activation. It opened a small compartment in his wrist, showing a control node glowing blue. He touched it and the lights in the corridor changed. The station's internal drones powered down momentarily, as if recognizing him. The armor explained that it still held partial access to the old Virilan systems built long ago. The raiders hesitated, uncertain what was happening. Ishan took that moment to step forward and project his voice through the armor's amplifier. He told them to stop, firing that no one needed to die. The raiders ignored him and fired a missile into the hallway. The explosion roared, but the armor absorbed the shock, turning the blast into harmless light. Lyrix watched him and whispered that the old tale said only those bound by purpose, not power, could command the armor. That moment she realized he was no accident. The armor had waited for a human because humanity's resilience and empathy fit the code better than pride or lineage. She climbed into the tug and activated the engines, calling for him to come now. The raiders tried again, breaking formation as the tug powered up. Ishan turned once more, raised his arm and focused. The armor responded by bending the missile trajectory upward through a hole in the hull. The missile shot out into space and exploded harmlessly. With the base shaking, they lifted off, braking from the station and heading into the void. The armor merged with the tug's systems, improving navigation and stabilizing the shields. The stars stretched into long streams as they entered jump space. For the first time since it began, silence returned. Lyrix sat back, breathing hard. She looked at Ishan and said he should not even be alive after that. The armor drained most beings to death in seconds, yet he looked steady, calm, almost at peace. Ishan said he felt fine, that the armor felt heavy but familiar, like carrying responsibility, not burden. He asked where they were going. She said to the ice moon of Tareth, an old shrine, world of her clan, where maybe they could find records to explain what had happened. She warned that the council would not stop. They would call him a thief, a weapon, maybe even a curse, as the tug drifted through the silent blue of jump space. Ishan closed his eyes and listened to the voice within the armor. It whispered of forgotten oaths of unity between species once broken by greed. It spoke of the Starborn code that sought protectors, not conquerors. He did not fully understand, but he knew. One thing: he would not let the armor be used for harm. Lyrix watched him from the pilot seat, seeing something in him that her people had lost: faith and courage without arrogance. As they neared Tareth, the stars returned to points of light and a pale frozen world came into view. The next test was waiting, and neither of them knew what it would demand. The secret lineage, the small tug ship, drifted down through the thin clouds of the ice moon. Tareth, its hull trembling against the cold winds that moved like whispering ghosts. Lyrix guided the controls with care while Ishan stood beside her, the armor faintly glowing under dim light. The moon's surface spread below them in endless white plains broken by black rock ridges and old temple ruins. Half-buried structures poked through the snow, their shapes sharp and alien. The armor pulsed faintly, as if recognizing something deep below. Lyrix said her ancestors once came here to renew their bond with the Starborn, a group of ancient guardians who defended free worlds from tyranny long before the council existed. She thought the place was abandoned, but now she felt the weight of eyes unseen. The tug landed near a valley of carved pillars etched with glowing runes. The air was cold but breathable. They stepped outside, their boots crunching on frost. The silence was heavy. Ishan looked around, feeling the armor react to every movement. It was like the moon itself remembered him. Lyrics led him toward a broken archway where faint lights flickered under the snow. They brushed aside the ice, revealing a staircase leading into darkness. The armor illuminated automatically, casting a soft blue glow that filled the chamber below. The walls were lined with murals, showing tall figures, both human and alien, fighting side by side against massive shadow shapes. Lyrics paused, tracing the symbols with her hand. She said these were written in an old dialect lost even to scholars, but the armor translated them in Ishan's mind. He spoke softly, repeating the translation aloud. It said that the Starborn were not a single race, but a covenant of many worlds united by will, not blood, and that the armor would always choose one who valued life over power. Lyrics looked at him, stunned, for in her culture lineage defined worth. Yet here stood proof that worth was chosen by action. They reached a central hall where a crystal throne stood, cracked by age. Around it were statues of warriors, some clearly Virellan, others unmistakably human. The realization hit them both. Humans had stood here before. The records of Earth's early contact had always been vague, but this was undeniable. The armor hummed louder, and a beam of light shot from its chest, striking the crystal throne. The room responded, ancient machines waking after centuries. Holograms filled the air, showing battlefield stars and cities long gone. Voices echoed fragments of messages, oaths of loyalty and sorrow. Lyrics watched one recording where a human and a Virellan leader clasped hands, promising to defend one another. The Starborn symbol appeared on their wrists, the same that now glowed on Ishan's armor. Ishan asked the armor what happened to them. The voice answered that the covenant was betrayed by fear. Some worlds grew jealous of others, and the council rose from that jealousy, promising order at the cost of freedom. The Starborn resisted and were erased from history. The armor said it had slept, waiting for balance to return. Lyric sat quietly, processing the truth. Everything she had been taught was twisted pride disguised as history. Her people had abandoned their allies, and now she bore the shame of that legacy. Yet Ishan did not look at her with anger. He simply said that past mistakes did not define the future and that they had a chance to fix it. They spent hours exploring deeper chambers, finding relics of technology and records stored in crystal nodes. The armor translated and projected maps showing hidden vaults across nearby systems where other fragments of the Starborn archives were sealed. Lyrics found one entry about the Virellan line, specifically mentioning a blood oath tied to her family name. It said her ancestors swore to protect the human lineage because humanity's adaptability was the seed of renewal. She trembled, reading it, realizing her duty was not to rule but to serve as guardian of that promise. She turned to Ishan and bowed her head, saying that the armor had chosen right. Before Ishan could respond, the armor's sensors flared, warning of ships entering orbit. They rushed outside and saw the night sky flashing with streaks of red energy, council ships dropping from warp. Lyrics cursed softly, saying the fixer must have traced their jump signature. They had no time to hide. The armor extended a field around them, cloaking their heat, but the ships began deploying ground troops anyway. Drones spread across the valley, scanning for movement. Ishan told Lyrics to get back to the tug, but she refused, saying this was her fight too. The armor formed a visor over Ishan's face and displayed tactical data, showing drone routes and weak spots. He moved with surprising precision, guiding Lyrics behind cover while small bursts of plasma hit the snow nearby. He lifted his arm and sent a pulse that disrupted several drones, making them crash into the ice. One large troop carrier descended, opening its bay doors and unleashing armored soldiers. Their leader shouted through a loudspeaker, demanding surrender of the relic and promising leniency. Ishan stood tall, the armor glowing brighter. He shouted back, saying the relic was not stolen, it had awakened on its own. The soldiers advanced, ignoring his words. Lyrics drew her old sidearm, though she knew it was useless. The armor spoke again, suggesting a non-lethal deterrent field. He approved it, and the air rippled with blue light. The soldiers froze, mid-step, their weapons shorted out by the pulse. Ishan walked forward through the snow, leaving bright footprints glowing from residual energy. He deactivated the field once they were disarmed and said they should leave while they could. The soldiers fled toward their ship in fear, one of them whispering the name Starborn. When the sky cleared, Lyrix and Ishan returned to the tug. They both knew the council would not stop now. The signal of the armor's reactivation would have spread through every listening post in the sector. Ishan asked the armor if there were any allies left. The armor replied that some still lived hidden among fringe worlds, descendants of the Covenant who waited for the sign. Lyrix smiled faintly, saying, then they would go find them. She input new coordinates based on the map. The armor projected one that led toward a remote asteroid colony known for its freedom and distrust of the Council. As the tug rose from Tereth, the shrine below powered down again, returning to silence. The statues watched them go, their shadows long under the moonlight. Ishan looked out the viewport and felt the weight of what they had discovered. He had come to space as a simple mechanic seeking work, and now he carried the hope of an ancient alliance. Lyrix looked at him and saw the calm strength that made the armor choose him. She said quietly that maybe the Starborn never truly died. They only waited for someone to remember why they fought. The armor pulsed once in agreement as the stars stretched before them, and the journey to rebuild the forgotten. Covenant began building a team. The journey from the frozen moon of Tereth to the free colony of Vornedge took 3 long days through deep space, where the stars burned faint and distant. The tug ship held steady, guided by the armor's navigation support, while Lyrix tried to repair the hull damage from their last fight. She worked in silence for most of the trip, but every now and then she glanced at Ishan, who sat near the control panels, his hand resting lightly on the chest plate that had changed both their lives. The armor was quiet now, almost like it was sleeping, but he could still feel its heartbeat like a soft rhythm under his skin. He wondered what it meant to be chosen by something that old, something that seemed to remember a time when humans and aliens fought as one. Lyrix finally spoke, saying that Vornedge was not safe, but it was free. It was a station run by miners, traders, and smugglers who followed no council law. If they wanted to hide or gather allies, it was the best place to start. When they reached orbit, the station appeared as a cluster of metal rings spinning slowly around a dark asteroid. Thousands of lights blinked across its surface like a city in the sky. Lyrix sent a landing code and after a tense pause received permission to dock. She told Ishan that the people here respected strength but not arrogance, and that they should keep the armor hidden for now. He nodded and covered it with a thick jacket before they stepped out. The air in Vornedge smelled of fuel and iron. The corridors were crowded with beings from a dozen species, and the noise of trade deals and laughter echoed everywhere. Lyrix led him through a maze of stalls until they reached an old cantina run by a retired freighter captain named Jorek, who owed her family a favor. Jorek was a tall, gray-scaled alien with deep eyes that seemed to read everything at once. He greeted Lyrix warmly, then looked at Ishan with suspicion. Lyrix explained part of the truth, saying the council was after them for uncovering a relic from her ancestors. Jorek frowned but said any enemy of the council was welcome in his port. They sat at a corner table while Jorek called a few trusted people to meet them. A young coder named Miri arrived first, carrying a small cube of data. She was barely out of her teens and spoke faster than anyone Ishan had met. She said she could break council transmissions and hide signals if given the right power source. Next came a medic monk named Pharaon from a pacifist order who had left his world after seeing too much council cruelty. He offered help not for violence but for those who would be caught in its path. Last came a miner couple, strong and quiet, who had lost their son to council raids and wanted to fight back. The group was small, but their eyes all carried the same spark. The refusal to bow, Ishan listened quietly, and then told them about the armor. Not all the details, but enough to show they were facing something larger than bounty hunters. He said he wanted to rebuild what was lost, not for revenge, but to give others a choice. Lyrix watched as the group agreed to join. Their small tug was soon transformed into a better ship. Jorek provided parts from his scrapyard, and Miri linked the armor's energy core to the engines, doubling their speed. Ishan trained every day in the cargo bay, learning to control the armor's strength without harming the equipment. The armor adapted, teaching him faster and faster. Could now form energy shields, shape magnetic fields, and sense threats before they appeared. Lyrix trained beside him, relearning tactics her ancestors once used. She found joy in fighting beside someone who did not crave power, but carried it like a responsibility. Their first mission as a team came sooner than expected. A convoy of refugees traveling from a collapsed mining world was ambushed by council patrols outside Vornedge. Jorek received the distress call, but most captains ignored it, afraid of losing trade rights. Ishan stood up and said they were going. The crew armed the cutter and flew into the field. The armor synced with the ship, forming an energy web that improved targeting and shields. The convoy was scattered and burning. When they arrived, Ishan took the helm while Lyrics coordinated the rescue. Miri hacked into the patrol communication and spread false orders, confusing the enemy. Ferran tended to the wounded in the cargo hold. The miner couple used their knowledge of asteroid belts to guide the convoy through safe paths as the fight reached its peak. A patrol frigate locked onto their cutter with heavy cannons. Ishan focused, and the armor responded, projecting a sphere of energy around the ship. The cannons fired, but the shots bent away, curving harmlessly into space. It drained him heavily, but he held it long enough for Lyrics to launch a countersignal that shut down the frigate's engines. The refugees escaped, and the council patrol retreated. The crew cheered as silence returned, but Ishan fell to one knee, his vision swimming. The armor whispered to him to rest, saying the body must learn balance before power. Lyrics knelt beside him and steadied him, whispering that he had done more than her best warriors ever did with full fleets. When they returned to the station, news of their victory spread fast. The people of Vornedge began to see them as symbols of hope. Small ships pledged support, offering supplies and safe routes. Even smugglers started passing them information about council movements. Jorek warned that the council fixer who hunted them before had now declared them terrorists. He said the fixer was building a case, calling the armor a stolen weapon of mass destruction. Ishan simply replied that the truth would come out when they reached the council itself. Lyrics felt pride and fear, both knowing that the path they had chosen would change the galaxy or destroy them. That night, as the others rested, Ishan stood alone on the observation deck watching the stars. The armor shimmered faintly, reflecting the light of distant suns. He asked quietly why it had chosen him. The voice inside replied that humanity had forgotten its role, but not its heart. The covenant of Starborn was built on hearts that never gave up even when powerless. It said his calm under fire and his mercy in battle proved he understood that real strength is restraint, not rage. He asked if that meant he was now one of the Starborn. The voice said, not yet, but the code was awakening and soon others would answer its call. Lyrics joined him and they stood in silence. She told him her ancestors once believed only Virellans could carry the light of the armor, but now she knew the truth. It was not race but resolve. She promised to stand beside him until the end, whatever came. He smiled faintly, saying, then they would face it together. The armor pulsed softly between them like a shared heartbeat. Beyond the window, the stars stretched endless and bright, and among them somewhere the council prepared its countermove, unaware that a small ship with a human and an alien girl had just reignited the forgotten fire of the Starborn. The price of courage, the days after the battle over Vornedge, turned into restless planning and uneasy silence. The small crew who had saved the refugee convoy became legends among the free traders, but fame brought danger as well. Every port signal crackled with rumors that the council fixer had placed the highest bounty ever issued for a human and a Virellan working together. Jorek warned them that the bounty hunters would not care about truth or justice, only credits, and that the council would use this chaos to turn allies into enemies. Still, Ishan refused to hide. He believed that running would make them no different from the frightened worlds that bowed to the council's threats. Lyric stood by his side, saying that her ancestors had once taken the same oath to protect those who could not protect themselves. Together, they decided to take the fight closer to the core and find proof that could clear their names. Miri intercepted a coded message from an informant deep inside the council's archives. It mentioned a prisoner ship called the Vigilant Dawn holding a historian named Orson, who once studied the Starborn Covenant before being silenced. The message claimed that Orson carried a key to unlock the council's sealed records. If they freed him, he could prove the alliance between humans and Varellans and expose the Council's lies. The crew gathered in the cargo bay to plan Pharaon. The monk warned that the vigilant Dawn was guarded by a full squadron and heavily shielded. The miner couple offered to guide them through an asteroid field that could hide their approach. Lyric suggested they strike during the ship's maintenance cycle when its systems would be weakest. Aishan listened quietly, then said they would go, not for revenge, but for truth. Everyone agreed, knowing the risk as the cutter prepared for launch. Jorek met them at the hangar, his old eyes somber. He handed Ishan a small device, saying it was an old scrambler that could confuse Council trackers for a short time. He said that if they survived, they should not return because the Council would burn the entire station just to find them. Ishan clasped his hand in thanks, promising they would bring proof to end this war of shadows. Then the cutter slipped into the void, its engines silent, and its crew ready. The asteroid field around the vigilant Dawn was a labyrinth of spinning rocks glowing faintly with heat from old mining drills. The crew flew through narrow gaps dodging debris, while Miri hacked into the patrol beacons rerouting signals to show empty space. Ahead, the massive prison ship hung like a fortress, its hull black with deep red markings. Lyric stared at it and said the design was ancient, built during the first wars of control, when the Council learned how to cage entire populations. The armor whispered to Ishan that it recognized the structure it had once served as a transport for captured Starborn warriors before they vanished. Ishan's hands tightened on the controls. He felt the weight of their spirits in the dark. They approached in the shadow of a large asteroid and docked near a maintenance port. The plan was simple. Lyrics and Ishan would infiltrate the detention level to find Orson, while Miri and Pharaon monitored from the ship. The miners stayed at the engines ready to jump at the first sign of trouble. Inside the corridors, the air was cold and dry, filled with the hum of distant machinery. The armor dimmed its glow, blending with the shadows. They moved swiftly past cameras and guards using the scrambler Jorek had given them. When they reached the cell block, Lyric scanned the doors until she found the name Orson, etched faintly into one plate. The door opened to reveal an older alien, with pale eyes and a calm expression. He looked at them as if he had been waiting. He said he knew they would come one day because the Starborn code always found a way to renew itself. He handed Ishan a data crystal glowing faintly and said it held the activation phrase that could unlock the sealed archive in the Council hall. Lyrics asked him why the Council feared the truth so much. He answered that fear was their weapon. If the people ever remembered that unity once broke their chains, the Council would lose everything. Before they could leave, alarms blared. The scrambler burned out and guards flooded the corridor. Ishan told Lyrics to take Orson and run while he held the line. The armor came alive again, wrapping him in light as he stepped into the open hallway. Plasma fire filled the air, but the bolts bent around him. His every motion was a dance of defense, not destruction. He struck with precision, disarming rather than killing. The armor grew brighter. Feeding on his resolve, Lyrics reached the docking bay with Orson, but a collapsing beam fell across the path. She tried to lift it, but her strength failed. Ishan appeared moments later, his armor sparking from damage. He lifted the beam with one hand and carried them both through. The ship shook as Council fighters surrounded it. The miner couple fired thrusters to push them clear while Miri overloaded the shields for one last burst of power. They escaped, but not without cost. The explosion from the field tore through the rear hull, injuring the miners and damaging the reactor. Ishan felt guilt twist in his chest as he helped them to the med bay. Pharaon worked quickly, but one of the miners, the father who had guided them through the rocks, was fading. He smiled weakly, saying his son would have been proud, and told Ishan to finish what he started before closing his eyes forever. The silence that followed was heavy. The crew mourned quietly as they drifted in safe space. Orson placed a hand on Ishan's shoulder, saying, "Courage always has a price, and that the dead were not lost if the living carried their purpose forward." The data crystal glowed softly as if aware of the promise made. Ishan inserted it into the console, and the armor projected a symbol across the bridge. It showed the Council, hall on the capital world, and the coordinates of the hidden archive. Lyrics looked at him and said that if they brought this to light, it would change everything. But she also warned that the council fixer would rather destroy entire colonies than let them speak. Ishan replied that truth should not depend on fear. He said that the Starborn fought not to rule but to remind the galaxy that freedom was worth pain. When they reached the edge of the capital system, they saw fleets gathering like storms. The council had prepared their trap hoping to end the legend before it grew. The armor hummed deeply, ready for war. Lyrics placed her hand over Ishan's, saying, whatever happened next, they would face it together. Behind them, the crew stood, ready, Miri at the consoles, Ferran at the med station, Orson calm despite the odds. They all knew the fight ahead would test more than strength. It would test the meaning of courage itself. Ishan looked at the stars beyond the viewport and whispered that he would not run that. Even if they fell, the truth would reach someone, and that would be enough. The armor pulsed once in silent agreement as the cutter turned toward the light of the capital and the final confrontation that would decide the fate of their worlds. Turning the tide. The cutter emerged from jump space into a battlefield that stretched across the dark side of the capital world. The sky was alive with energy bursts and the glowing trails of ships firing across the void. The council fleet had set a wide perimeter to intercept them, dozens of cruisers and frigates in perfect formation. Their shields shimmered like a steel wall against the stars. Ishan gripped the controls while the armor mapped every vector and movement. Across the field, Lyric stood beside him, calm but determined. She told him that they could not win with fire alone. They had to expose the truth before the council could silence them again. Miri relayed a signal to the fringe networks broadcasting live coordinates so that every free world could see what was about to happen. Orson stood behind them, holding the data crystal that could unlock the council archive, his expression peaceful, as if this was the moment he had lived for. The first wave of council fighters closed in their weapons, flashing through the dark. The cutter shuddered under impact, but the armor extended its field through the ship, absorbing the energy and redirecting it as harmless light. Lyrics ordered evasive maneuvers, while the Minor Mother took over the gunnery controls, sending precise shots that disabled enemy engines instead of destroying them. Ishan could feel the armor guiding his instincts every turn, every movement. He no longer needed the interface to fly. It was as if the ship and the armor had become one. He closed his eyes and saw through sensors and walls as if the entire cutter was his body. The armor whispered tactical data, and the rhythm of the battle began to make sense. Through the chaos, a massive council dreadnought appeared, larger than any ship they had faced before. Its captain was the Fixer himself, the one who had hunted them since the armor first awoke. His voice came through the comm, deep and cold, saying that the age of chaos was over and that the Starborn name would be erased forever. He promised safe passage for the crew if they surrendered the armor. Ishan responded not with anger but with calm. He said that the armor was not a weapon of conquest. It was a memory of unity that no threat could erase. The Fixer laughed, calling him naive, and ordered all guns to fire. The dreadnought unleashed a storm of plasma that could have vaporized a city. The cutter shook violently, and alarms filled the bridge. But the armor adapted, changing its field into a layered pattern that dispersed the blast across the vacuum. The light around the ship glowed brighter than the sun's for a brief moment, and then faded, leaving the cutter unharmed. The Fixer hesitated, realizing brute force would not work. He sent smaller assault ships to board them. Lyrics and Ishan prepared for close combat. The corridors filled with noise and flashes as armored troops broke through the hull. Ishan met them at the breach, his armor fully awakened, now shining silver and blue. Each step he took sent waves through the air, disarming weapons without killing. The armor seemed to read his heart, mirroring his resolve. He moved like water through stone, never stopping, never hesitating. Lyrics fought, beside him with blades made from her ancestor's forge, every strike guided by purpose. They cleared the corridor together, until only silence remained on the bridge. Miri shouted that the broadcast was active. Hundreds of channels across the sector were watching. The armor extended its range through her console, linking to the data crystal Orson carried. The projection filled the sky for everyone to see, records of the old alliance between humans and Virellans, proof that the council had betrayed its founding principles. The faces of long-dead heroes appeared in the light, their oaths echoing across the stars. "We stand as one to guard the free, the weak, and the forgotten." The message carried through open comms to every fleet and every station. The soldiers who fought against them began to pause, hesitating at the sight. The legend was no longer myth, it was truth, but the fixer was not finished. He commanded his ship's central weapon to charge an energy lance capable of tearing through moons. He declared that if he could not control the Starborn legacy, he would destroy it. He aimed directly at the cutter, but before he could fire, a familiar voice cut across the comm. It was the mid-tier captain who once spared them after the first battle. His ship had arrived with a handful of defectors. He said that the Council's lies had gone too far and that justice was worth more than orders. His fleet turned its guns on the dreadnought, firing in perfect unison. The explosion rippled across the void, shaking the capital world's orbit. The cutter dove through the firestorm, heading straight for the dreadnought's core. Ishan guided it with precision, the armor linked with the dreadnought's control systems, creating a feedback loop that overloaded its weapons and engines. Lyrics and the crew held tight as alarms blared around them. Ishan focused every ounce of his will into one command. He told the armor to stop the fight without killing anyone. The armor pulsed deeply, and for the first time spoke in a voice that was not mechanical but human and ancient. It said, "Command accepted." A wave of light burst from the cutter, spreading across the battlefield. Every weapon fell silent, every engine froze in place, not destroyed, but suspended. The wave expanded, touching every ship in range and even the surface below. For one entire hour, the galaxy stood still. Ships that had been locked in combat floated quietly side by side. Soldiers looked at each other across empty space, realizing that for the first time in living memory there was peace. The armor's energy drained to near silence, but Ishan stayed conscious, breathing slow and steady. Lyrics looked at him, tears forming in her eyes. She said he had done what her people had failed to do for centuries. He had stopped war without spilling blood. The fixer's dreadnought was powerless, drifting as the mid-tier captain boarded to arrest him. The crew of the cutter gathered around Ishan, whose armor now dimmed to a dull silver ferron. The monk whispered a prayer of gratitude while Miri kept the broadcast running, showing the stillness of the battlefield to every watching world. Orson smiled softly, saying that the Starborn code had awakened, not through strength but through mercy. Ishan could barely stand, but he felt peace inside him. The armor's voice returned faintly, saying the tide had turned, but the choice was still theirs. What came next would shape the new age, when the ships began to move again. No one fired. The Council's fleet held position awaiting orders, but their command was gone, replaced by confusion and awe. Lyric sent a final message to every channel, saying that the Starborn were not rulers, but reminders that power means nothing without honor. She asked every world to decide for itself whether it would follow fear or freedom. The response came like a wave from the farthest colonies to the inner worlds. Ships powered down their weapons and declared independence. The fixer was taken away in silence, and the council chamber that had ruled for generations stood empty for the first time. As the cutter turned away from the battlefield, Ishan looked at the stars, now calm, and said softly that maybe this was only the beginning. The armor rested against his skin, quiet but alive. Lyrics took his hand and told him that whatever the next chapter held, they would face it as one. The void stretched before them, vast and waiting, as the light of distant suns reflected on the hull, and the legend of the Starborn began to rise once more from the ashes of a galaxy that had finally remembered its heart resolution and oath. The cutter drifted in orbit above the capital world, its engines humming low, as if exhausted from the struggle that had changed the face of the galaxy. Below them, the planet glowed with streaks of city lights and ocean reflections, and across every continent, the broadcasts from their final battle still echoed through public networks, repeating the images of the Starborn oath and the stillness that followed the wave of peace. The crew sat in silence, each one lost in thought, their hearts heavy with relief and the weight of what they had done. Lyrics leaned against the viewport, her eyes reflecting the light of the sunrise rising slowly over the planet she had once feared to see again. She whispered that her people would not understand at first, that they would struggle to accept a human had carried the armor that their ancestors once claimed as sacred, but she said time would heal what pride had broken. Ishan sat in the command chair, quiet, his armor now dull silver without the glow of battle. The voice inside had grown faint like an old friend fading away. He knew it had, given everything to create that one moment of peace, and now it rested. He could still feel its warmth, though, like a heartbeat deep under his skin. The others moved gently around him. Pharaon, tending to the wounded minor mother who refused to rest, until she saw her son's name engraved into the ship's log. Miri replaying the broadcast over and over to ensure no one could twist the truth. Orson writing down every word of what had happened to keep the memory alive for generations. They all understood that what they had built was fragile, and that peace could not survive without care. A message came through the comm, an invitation from the newly formed Council of Free Worlds requesting that Ishan and Lyrix appear before them to witness the new vote that would decide the fate of the old regime. Ishan looked at Lyrix and nodded, saying it was time to finish what they had started. The cutter descended through the clouds toward the capital city that had once been a fortress of fear. Now its towers glowed with banners of different colors from dozens of freed species. The air was filled with ships carrying delegates and citizens who had come to see the moment when the chains of the old order would be broken. They landed at the grand hall where crowds lined the streets cheering as the crew stepped out. The people shouted their names, calling them Starborn, not as a title of war but as a symbol of unity. Ishan walked slowly, the armor reflecting the light around him, not in brilliance but in humble shine. Lyrix walked beside him, her head high, not as a warrior seeking glory but as a guardian, fulfilling her vow. Inside the hall, the delegates rose from their seats in silence. Some were Virellan elders, others were humans, from Earth who had come after receiving the first message from the stars. There were also species that had once served the council, forced to obey, but now free to speak. Each one carried a scar from the old world and a hope for the new. The presiding speaker, an elder named Soren, stood and declared the session open. He spoke of the past, of the centuries of control and the silence that followed rebellion. He said the time had come to replace fear with cooperation, to dissolve the Council of Dominance, and build a new alliance where every world had equal voice. Then he asked Ishan to step forward and speak for the Starborn. Ishan hesitated at first, saying he was not a leader or a ruler, just a man who had been in the wrong place at the right time. But Soren smiled and told him that sometimes history chose its speakers not for their power, but for their heart. Ishan stepped to the center, his voice calm and clear. He told them that the armor did not choose him for strength or blood, but because he refused to turn away when others were in danger. He said the Starborn were never meant to rule. They were meant to remind everyone that life was shared, that strength meant nothing without compassion. He told them that peace was not a prize to keep but a promise to uphold. He asked them to honor that promise not with monuments but with actions, with mercy and courage. He finished by saying that if the Starborn Code meant anything, it meant that no world should kneel again. Not before the council, not before fear, and not before war. When he stepped back, the hall was silent. Then one by one the delegates stood in agreement and raised their hands. The vote passed without dissent. The Council of Control was dissolved and replaced by the Alliance of Free Worlds, bound not by power but by choice. Cheers filled the hall, and for a moment the weight of the past lifted. Lyrix turned to him, smiling through tears, saying her ancestors would have bowed to him in respect. But he shook his head, saying they would have stood beside him, and that was enough. After the ceremony, they returned to the ship to prepare for the journey home. The broadcast of the new alliance spread through every corner of the known systems, and even the quiet colonies of Earth received it. In a small observatory overlooking the Pacific, a group of scientists and children watched the transmission in awe as the image of Ishan and Lyrix appeared with the Starborn symbol shining behind them. Earth responded with a single message sent to every channel. We remember who we are, and we stand with those who choose peace. The reply arrived as their ship prepared to jump, and for the first time Ishan felt that the distance between Earth and the stars no longer mattered. In the quiet that followed, Lyrix asked what he would do now that the armor was silent. He said he would return home to rebuild ships and teach others what he had learned. But he also said that if the armor ever called again, he would answer. She nodded, saying she would help rebuild the Starborn Order not as soldiers but as teachers and explorers. Pharaon blessed them both, saying that the light they carried would guide generations to come. Miri said she would build a network to share truth faster than lies. Orson planned to open a library on Vorn Edge dedicated to the covenant that once united the stars. As the cutter lifted from the capital, one last time Ishan looked out the viewport, watching the blue horizon curve beneath. Then he saw the scars of old war fading under new light. He thought of the fallen, the Minor Father, the refugees, the silent armor, and the countless souls who had dreamed of this day. He whispered a quiet oath, promising that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. Lyrics joined him, placing her hand over his heart and repeating the words of the old Starborn creed. To guard without conquest, to lead without crown, to fight without hate, and to stand even when alone. The ship rose higher through the sky until the stars returned above them, endless and shining. The armor pulsed once faintly as if answering the vow, then grew still. The crew stood together at the viewport, watching as the planet grew smaller behind them. Ahead lay the open dark, vast and full of possibility. Ishan smiled softly, saying that this was not the end but the beginning of a new chapter. The Starborn had returned not as warriors, but as keepers of peace, and in the silent sea of stars where countless worlds turned. In light and shadow, the name of the Starborn would once again mean hope.